Grace Bussell was given a Silver Life-Saving Medal for her efforts to save the lives of the passengers of the Georgette. Samuel Yebble Isaacs, a stockman who worked for her family, received a bronze. The papers across Australia celebrated at Australian Grace Darling. Few of them mentioned the name of Samuel Yebble Isaacs. As for who may have saved how many, it is something we will probably never know.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the Georgette's neglected hero?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Georgette had already been a topic for newspapers in the year of 1876. She had been the ship that had chased after 6 escaping Irish prisoners who were fleeing Australia on board of the American whaling ship, the Catalpa. The Georgette had played an important role in the incident, chasing after the escaping convicts and threatening to fire on the American vessel. But the Catalpa and the 6 prisoners who had successfully reached America had definitely been the stars of the occasion. It is doubtful that anyone realized that 9 months later, the Georgette herself would be the center of a media flurry. The Australian-owned Georgette was one of the first steamers to make a regular appearance on the routes of Western Australia. She had been built in Dumbarton in the UK in 1872, and had immediately been bought by Thomas Connor out of Fremantle. The 460-ton screw steamer was put to work in 1873 on what would be her regular route between Albany and Geraldton. She was a ship that carried both cargoes and passengers between these points, frequently with additional stops according to the needs of those on board or the cargo that she had loaded. It was therefore expected to be a routine voyage when the Georgette, under the command of Captain John Godfrey, left Fremantle en route for Adelaide. Though there is some debate about the exact number of passengers on board, it seems to have been between 40 and 50. On board the ship was also a cargo of jarrah, an Australian hardwood, some baled leather, and some hides. While loading, a large piece of jarrah fell into the hold. Though it was an incident that did not receive any comment at the time, it would later be at the front of everyone's minds. A few days after loading her cargo, on the 29th of November, the Georgette left Fremantle on what would be her final voyage. The ship's first 2 stops were brief, first at Dunbury and then at Busselton. On the evening of the 30th, the Georgette departed from Busselton. Midnight that night, the first word of trouble reached Captain Godfrey's ear. The ship had sprung a leak. The captain, hearing of the leak, however, was not the first that anyone on the ship learned of it. The first engineer first noticed around 8 o'clock that night that there was an unusual amount of water in the ship, but his report to the captain was not worded in this way. Instead, he reported to the captain that the bilge pump was not working correctly, and he suggested that the deck pumps should be prepared in case they were needed. The crew was most likely already aware of the malfunctioning of the pump, since one of the passengers, James Dempster, would later write that he noticed the crew pouring water into the pump of the engine before the ship started. Captain Godfrey did not think much of the report, since it was brought to him as a pump malfunction rather than anything more serious. The second engineer also does not seem to have thought much of the increase of water, since at no point did he go investigate where the water was coming from either. The ship was allowed to keep on taking water until it became clear that it was not just a malfunctioning pump, but something much more serious. By then, it was too late to determine where it was coming from exactly. Officially, the cause of the leak was never determined. But more than one person would point to the fall of a large piece of jarrah a few days before, and wonder if it had not caused a weakness in the ship that had now come back to haunt them. It was only at midnight that it was determined by the ship's crew that they were experiencing a leak, and by now the water was noticeable. They attempted to rig the pumps, but they found that none of them were working. By 4 a.m, both the crew and some of the passengers were armed with buckets and went to work bailing the ship. Even with these measures, the water continued to gain, and by 6 a.m. there was an estimated 8 feet of water in the engine room, though none in the forward compartment. They could be thankful that the entire hold of the ship was not filling with water, but the location of the leak was also one of the worst possible, since at 6 a.m, the fires in the boiler were extinguished by the rising water. The ship now had only her 2 masts to depend on to reach safety, and the weather was growing worse. Captain Godfrey made the decision to turn towards the land. By 9 a.m, it was becoming clear that the ship's best choice would be to be beached, but they were still 15 miles offshore, north of Cape Lewin. Captain Godfrey also ordered that the lifeboat and the captain's gig should be lowered over the side and filled with passengers in case there was a need to abandon ship. As often happened in that era, in such conditions, the women and children were loaded first, though this was to prove to be a curse rather than a blessing on this instance. The lifeboat was in distress from the moment they lowered it. It was so leaky that they had to commence bailing immediately. Even as they loaded 3 men and 14 women and children into it, they were still struggling to get the captain's gig underway. And so the lifeboat drew near to the ship to load even more women and children. Unfortunately for all involved, the lifeboat almost immediately filled with water to such an extent that it caused a panic. Some people managed to spring from it back onto the ship, but others who rushed to follow their example upset the lifeboat entirely and caused it to capsize. Most of the people who were still on the boat were women and children when she flipped. Passenger William Dempster, brother to James Dempster, had by now gotten the captain's gig launched successfully, though it was also filling with water. Seeing the lifeboat crisis, he took his boat over to the people who were struggling in the water. Unfortunately, all of the people who were in the water were on one side of the captain's gig, and as they desperately tried to cling to the gig, it was beginning to also show signs of distress. William Dempster was not strong enough to pull any of the people out of the water on his own. The cabin boy jumped into the water to try to help, but he missed the gig and ended up clinging to the upside-down lifeboat. James Dempster, seeing that his brother was in trouble, grabbed an oar and jumped into the water. With William Dempster's assistance, he was able to scramble over the side of the gig. Once the two brothers were together, they were better able to balance the weight and begin rescue work. First, they pulled all of the young children they could find out of the water, and then they began working as a pair to pull up the women who were still in the water. Unfortunately, in the time it had taken them to steady the boat so they could begin the rescue, some people had already slipped below the surface. In total, 2 women and 5 children would not survive the boat capsizing. The people who were still on board the Georgette managed to get the gig to the stern of the ship, allowing the ship's first mate to get on board. They then departed the ship, making a stop at the upturned lifeboat. Now it was not just the cabin boys sitting on the upturned boat. The ship's second mate had also leaped into the water, hoping to help with the rescue, but he had missed the gig just as the cabin boy had, and had joined the cabin boy in sitting on the upside-down lifeboat. The gig now had the time to pull them off. Captain Godfrey, meanwhile, continued to head with as much speed as he could under the power of sail towards the shore in the wind that was picking up. This left the captain's gig with its total unenviable crew of 9 adults, 5 children, and 3 oars. They would eventually rig a blanket and an oar as a sail, and reach a safe shoreline where the ship's officers were able to find help from a homestead for their little party. They were now safe, though in the leaky little boat it probably did not seem very safe at the time. the Georgette was about to undergo her own trial. Though Captain Godfrey had hoped to reach the beach, instead they struck a sandbar a few ship lengths from the shore, and the weather was becoming rough. There was still a lifeboat remaining on the ship, and a few men went out in it with the intention of passing a lifeline from the ship to the shore. The waves were too rough for the small boat, though, and it capsized. This time, thankfully, there were no fatalities, and they were able to grab the boat and bring it back to the ship to make another attempt. This time, they loaded the lifeboat with passengers. Whether or not a lifeline was successfully attached to the shore would later be a matter of some contention. Again, after going a distance from the ship, the lifeboat capsized. The Australian Town and Country Journal would later rhapsodize. The poor creatures were all struggling in the water and in imminent peril of their lives, when on the top of a steep cliff appeared the figure of a young lady on horseback. The paper went on to proclaim that it was Grace Vernon Bussell, who had rode down an impossibly steep cliff with speed. Before reaching the shore, she urged her horse into the boiling surf, and rode out beyond the second line of breakers until she reached the boat. The book, Noble Deeds of the Worlds of Heroines, by Henry Charles Moore, and published in 1903, featured a picture of Grace Bussell on the cover, showing the young lady of 16 pulling people from the water while on horseback. Moore did acknowledge that Grace Bussell had not been alone. He showed her riding through the bush, accompanied by a native stockman, and coming towards the edge of the cliff saw the steamer in distress. He went on, as she drew near the boat, closely followed by the stockman. Hope revived in the hearts of the shivering women and children. In his account, the women and children in the water cling to the clothing of the horses of the riders, who skillfully save them, riding time and again into the raging surf. Moore at least shows the stockman as an equal helpmate, though he chooses not to have named him. Indeed, if he was drawing from the papers of the time, he might not have even known the man's name. Samuel Yebble Isaacs was the son of an American whaler and an Aboriginal woman of the Wardandi people. His name reflects his background, Samuel Isaacs being his European name, and Yebble being his Aboriginal name. Around 1860, he had come to the Bussell's land and began working for them as a stockman on their property on Margaret River, the mouth of which the Georgette had wrecked near. It was in this capacity that he was riding his horse along the cliff and saw the ship too close to the shore for comfort, though she had not struck the sandbar yet. He galloped his horse at full speed to the Bussell farm. The Bussells gave Isaac some rope and told him to come back if he needed any more help. The stories passed down from Isaacs paint a different story from those of the papers of the time, though Isaac's account was not preserved in the papers of the time, and we have to rely on oral tradition. In one version, all of the men were out, and so Grace Bussell was one of the few people around. She jumped into action at the chance to go help, and immediately had Isaac saddle her horse so she could ride out with him. In the other version, Mr. Bussell was at home, and at first he was reluctant to have Grace go, but she insisted. Once they rode into the water, Isaacs became alarmed at how recklessly she was riding into the water that was filled with people in danger, and sent her back to the shore. She took with her a woman and child clinging to her horse. In his version, he rode several times into the water to pull people out to safety, but he acknowledges that soon a lifeline was attached to the shore from the ship. The sworn statement of two of the passengers of the ship says that this lifeline was already attached to the shore before the two riders arrived, and that the evacuation was already underway. This statement says that the total of Grace and Isaac's rescue was Grace saving the women and child, and Sam saving another passenger who almost got swept out to sea. Most of the other passengers were able to struggle to shore on their own, according to the sworn statement. The statement does agree with every other account in one regard. Even the accounts that show Grace as the lone savior of the ship's crew and passengers admit that her horse's leg got tangled in a line, either the lifeline or the rope of one of the boats, and she was in real danger for a short while. Once all of the passengers were on shore, Isaacs and Grace rowed back to Bussell home to bring blankets and food. Grace's sister also rowed out from her home with more provisions once the news reached her of the wreck. As for the Georgette, her story ended with the wreck on the sandbar on the 1st of December 1876. She was a total loss. At the inquest, Captain Godfrey was brought up on 5 charges, as were some of his officers. Though they found him not guilty of those charges, the inquest did not find them blameless. Captain Godfrey was found guilty of a grave error of judgment in not taking further steps to determine the condition of his ship or heading back to port when he first heard from the first engineer that the bilge pump was not working. The first engineer was found guilty of neglect of duty for not directly informing the captain of the water increasing in the hold and only talking about a failing pump. The second engineer was found guilty of being aware of an increase of water on the ship and not trying to find the cause. Finally, the first officer was found guilty of not veering the lifeboat astern, as he was directed to by the captain, the reason that was assigned to the lifeboat capsizing and claiming the lives of 7 people. Captain Godfrey was also blamed for having put people in the first lifeboat at all, since they were not close to shore and there was no immediate danger to the ship at that moment. It was stated by the harbormaster at Perth and others that the moment that Captain Godfrey had realized the poor condition of the lifeboat, he should have abandoned the idea of putting people in it, since it was not an immediate emergency. All of the officers named had their certificates held, and Captain Godfrey's certificate was suspended for 18 months. It would not take long for the papers as well as the general public to latch on to the idea of a young heroine rushing into danger on horseback to save a ship full of people. It certainly helped that her name was Grace. Soon, she would be called Western Australia's Grace Darling. Meanwhile, Isaacs was often neglected entirely from accounts. And when he was mentioned, it was as a nameless stockman, or as the Bussell family's black servant. The Royal Humane Society gave Grace a silver medal and a gold watch, and the British Board of Trade also gave Grace a gold watch. As for Isaacs, he was presented a bronze medal by the Royal Humane Society and was later granted the full land title for Location 243. It was the first land grant to an Aboriginal person in Western Australia. As for the Dempster brothers, they are named on the plaque that stands at the site of the wreck for saving lives. But they do not seem to have received much recognition in their time, in spite of their own heroic actions to save the people who had been thrown into the water from the first lifeboat. Grace Bussell would later marry a Perth surveyor, who, as the stories have it, read about her heroic acts, and rode all the way from Perth to Bussell Farm with the object of matrimony. The surveyor that married Grace Bussell would later become the Surveyor General of Western Australia, and named a township Gracetown, and named a lake Grace Lake, both after his wife. In this way her legacy carried on, and when she died, a good portion of her obituary reminded everyone of the wreck of the Georgette. In 2021, after hard work by his great-grandson, Samuel Yebble Isaacs got his own recognition in the form of a locality. At first, he had suggested at the Bussell Highway, named after the influential family of Grace, be given a dual name with that of his great-grandfather, but in the end, renaming a section of land was suggested by the Landgate Agency. The land was taken partially from Gracetown, and also includes some of the land once owned by Isaacs, as well as some of the Leeuwin Naturalist National Park.
For more information, please see Loss of the Georgette from the Fremantle Herald from the 9th of December, 1876, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.